Welcome to today's event, co-hosted by the Student Borrower Protection Center and Small Business Majority. Our event today is titled How the Student Debt Crisis is Holding Back Small Businesses, Delivering Relief During COVID and Beyond. I now want to introduce our moderator for today and Student Borrower Protection Center Executive Director, Seth Frotman.
Thank you all for joining us for today's event, looking at how the student debt crisis is impacting small business owners and entrepreneurs. I'd first like to thank our partners at Small Business Majority who have helped make this event possible. Even before COVID started, this country was in the midst of a student debt crisis, a crisis that has affected people of every age and from all walks of life. Today, over 45 million Americans owe more than $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. And the fallout from this debt has had devastating impacts, particularly on the people and communities that are now bearing the brunt of the pandemic. If we truly are going to build back better, we must deliver relief from the crippling burden of student debt. Many of you have heard me say time and time again, we must also be honest and forthright about the deep and devastating consequences that student has on everything from rural communities to public health, from distorting labor markets to driving inequality. And today we will discuss another significant impact of this crisis, how the student debt crisis has impacted small business owners, and as importantly, how tackling student loan debt is a critical mechanism about how we support this vital economic sector and engine. We now face a growing body of evidence clearly demonstrating that even before the pandemic began, student debt was dragging down the small business sector, affecting owners' ability to invest and grow their companies, and holding back new businesses from being created. With small businesses accounting for 99.9% of all firms in this country, any economic recovery from COVID must prioritize helping small businesses. Addressing the burden of student debt represents a key part of that help. As more than 1/3 of small businesses across the country report that they may not survive beyond the next 3 months without assistance, the need for a lifeline to the small business community has never been more urgent. And that is why today's discussion is so important. We will hear from small business owners from across the country about their experiences trying to grow their businesses while dealing with student loan debt. We will talk also to advocates and policymakers who are on the front line supporting small business owners and highlight the solutions they believe can help support growth at this important time. First, though, we are delighted to have Congressman Andy Kim join us to speak about the work he is doing in Congress to support small businesses and why he believes addressing the student debt crisis is so important. A fellow New Jersey native, Representative Kim was first elected to the U.S. House in 2018, representing the 3rd District of New Jersey. In a little over 2 years in Congress, Rep. Kim has been a tremendous advocate for the great citizens of the Garden State and people across the country. As a member of the House Armed Services, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the House Committee on Small Business, more than 24 town halls and the over 4,000 constituent issues successfully resolved with federal agencies exemplifies Congressman Kim's dedication to working with and fighting for New Jersey families. And as a point of personal privilege, I've had the pleasure to know Andy for years now, and from our first conversations, I've seen and come to know his deep interest, passion, and tenacity for public service, and in particular for helping the millions of his constituents and tens of millions across the country struggling under the weight of student debt. And that is why I am so proud that he is with us here today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Representative Andy Kim.
Thank you, Seth. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your leadership in just constantly being someone that is calling out the need for these types of reforms and changes to be able to help support our countries. Thank you for that. I want to thank the Small Business Majority and the Student Borrower Protection Center for pulling this together. I don't want to take up too much time because there's a lot of good information that's going to be talked about today, but I wanted to just share with you a few thoughts of the framing that which I think about so often. Seth's right. You know, this is a really tough time. We all know how tough and difficult of a time it is especially during the coronavirus crisis. Small businesses pushed beyond the brink. Many of them closed or will be closing. The amount of help we need right now is enormous. But we also know is that the problems facing small businesses within our economy these problems didn't just arise because of COVID. These are challenges that we've seen on the forefront for well before the pandemic began. I served on the Small Business Committee in the last Congress and continuing to do so now. And I've seen these challenges full force in terms of what we need to do. And again, even before the pandemic, it shows you that these problems are going to last well after the pandemic is over. It's going to be a long road to recovery ahead. Obviously, we are doing a lot right now to try to focus in on what kind of immediate relief we need to be able to provide to our small businesses, to the American people, to our students. And that is a big part of it. But what you're talking about today goes beyond that as well. And it's thinking about how do we make sure that our small business sector, our economy in our country remains strong, that we can come out of this pandemic and continue to build on that going forward. How do we keep the innovation going? How do we keep the new ideas and the entrepreneurship moving forward? A lot of that comes down to opportunity and whether or not people feel like they have opportunity. And a big part of that is about what constraints are placed upon them for them as they're making these decisions. I think about this very personally. My wife and I, we are still paying off debt. We are struggling as one of the younger members of Congress. We are understanding how this impacts every decision that we make. The decision about whether to get married, when to get married, when to buy a car, buy a house, what types of jobs that we could go for. These were all decisions where we had to take into account our student debt and the problems that we faced. It was one of the biggest constraining factors as we thought about even when to have children in major parts of our life. And we know that this is something that is affecting students, affecting Americans as they're thinking about whether or not they can start a small business. This is something that we need to address. There's obviously a big question about not just student debt, but about why does education cost so much to start with in our country, about what kind of investments we need to make in small businesses. I get that. And that is certainly a big part of this and something that I will continue to press for in Congress. But there is an immediate question specific about what can we do to try to help people as they are dealing with these dilemmas right now, these decisions. That's something I want to work with all of you on, figuring out how we can come up with some solutions here. There are a couple ideas that we're working on in Congress and with the executive branch, and we'll continue to move some of those forward. But we need to make sure that we understand that these problems are not going to be solved by any single level of government alone or just by government alone. We need to find ways to be able to work together to be able to push this forward. So I want to keep that in mind as we're going forward. But I appreciate that you're taking the step to recognize and come here and get informed about these challenges, to hear directly from people that are facing these difficulties, and to understand that this is something that's not only good for our small businesses, but it's good for our country as a whole. And especially when we think about some of the people that are most affected by these challenges, some communities of color, students of color, immigrant communities, and others within our communities. I've seen it when it comes to women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, and others in terms of the challenges that they face when it comes to the debt that they carry. So I look forward to staying engaged with all of you and hearing about some of the ideas that you talk about today, figuring out how we can really implement them going forward to have a real tangible impact now and going forward as we try to think about what it is that we need to do to keep our country strong coming out through this pandemic, and making sure that we have an economy that can really last with the kind of perseverance that we know we need at this given time. So again, thank you so much for allowing me to speak with all of you for a couple minutes here, and look forward to hearing the panel discussion ahead. Thank you, and please stay safe and healthy. Take care.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for your words and your leadership. And now I am pleased to introduce our panelists for today's discussions. And we're going to hear directly from them shortly. But first, we have Jermaine Sufert, the director at Consultants for Children from Lakewood, Colorado. Tanya Jeans, co-owner and CFO of Jeans Management from Brownsburg, Indiana. John Arensmeyer, the CEO of Small Business Majority, and Nicole Perry, the Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services. So let's kick this off with Jermaine. Could you tell us a little bit about the work you do and your team, and how student debt has affected your ability to do your job and grow your business?
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here. I started Consultants for Children in 2002. I founded it to work with kids with autism primarily. And we have a really great group of staff who work with us who are master's level, state licensed, nationally certified individuals with lots of student debt. Myself, as a licensed counselor, as well as my staff, we have 8 years of college, so 8 years of loans. My own personal payments every month are actually less than what the interest is. And so when you look at my ability to grow, when agencies look at my debt to income ratio and they see the monthly ins and outs, and as well as the balance, it just obviously impacts banks' decisions as to whether or not to continue to help us grow into more locations. We're having our 9th location open this year, which is really exciting. But when I think about what we could have done since 2002, it could be that we could have doubled that or something, had more staff, or people may have been more willing to take other types of benefits, but they're looking for things like student loan reductions from an employer, which already has more student loans than I can afford myself. So that's just some examples, but I'm here to answer any questions anyone has.
Thank you so much for sharing your stories. And Tanya, if similar to Jermaine, if you could tell us a little bit about what you do, your company, and how you've seen student debt impact your ability to build your business.
Absolutely. Thank you for allowing me this platform. My name is Tanya Jeans, and I am a parent of 3. And I think for the biggest part of creating Jeans Management back in 2012, it was an opportunity to show my young men who are Black young men, and also my daughter, how you can catapult and jump into your own business and sustain a great business. We were in a position where our income really had an impact on my first child entering into the college arena. And because of our income and being middle-aged, it really hindered him in the ability to get grants. And so the reasonable thing was to do Parent Plus loans. What that has done for us is that it's given us a bag of debt, number one. It has caused us to prolong the ability to be full-time self-employed individuals. We have gone through situations where when you look at debt to income ratio, and along with like Jermaine, banks don't care that it's a Parent Plus loan. Banks don't care. They're going to look at the debt load that's on your credit report, and they're going to calculate that. I'm in the lending business. It can be up to 2% of that balance, and they really don't care what that payment is. So it has caused us to kind of slow down the process. And even today, with my loans being in deferment, unlike some other people that I'm learning that theirs are not, it's scary for me to think that when this debt comes back into my budget, what is that really going to look like for Jeans Management? So I'm truly interested in the discussion further in which we can help to bring more light to small businesses and minority business owners.
Thank you so much, Tanya. John, as the CEO of Small Business Majority, your organization represents thousands of small businesses and entrepreneurs, and thank you so much for what you do and for being here today. Can you speak to how student debt is holding back the ability to start and operate small businesses, and any specific examples that we should know about, that the audience should know about, the ways in which you're hearing student debt is affecting your members?
Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I'll start again. Anyway, thank you, Seth, for and your team for hosting this and for all the work you're doing at the Student Borrower Protection Center to really bring this issue to the fore and to help people understand how the impact it has on small businesses and the economy, something that's not well understood. Really quickly about us, we've been around for 15 years. We're a small business advocacy organization. We do work on policy and advocacy nationally and in states across the country. We have offices in 8 states across the country. We have a network of over 80,000 small businesses. And in addition to the advocacy work we do, we have a whole host of programs that we do to educate small business owners about things that can benefit them and about policies, et cetera. We've known for a long time that student debt is a major hindrance in the ability to start or operate a successful business. A survey we did pre-pandemic found that 48% of people with student debt who currently own or have plans to own a business said their student loan payments had impacted their ability to start a business. So that's almost half. Nearly 40% of people who are interested in opening a business said student loan payments affected their ability to do that. And 43% said their student debt affected their ability to invest in the business or hire employees. So this is all pre-pandemic. Now we look at what's going on in our economy, and it's even more dire. 400,000 businesses have closed, unemployment rates hovering around 6.3% now. Our survey has shown that 1 in 3 businesses will close if they don't get additional relief. This is particularly a problem in communities of color. 30% of entrepreneurs of color in the most recent survey we did said they're going to have to temporarily close their business in the next 3 months if they don't get additional relief. That's compared with just over 20% of white business owners. And 22% of business owners of color say they may lay off employees permanently compared to 14% of white business owners. So the last thing we need right now, once the student loan payment deferral ends this fall, are additional barriers to get small businesses back on their feet, particularly in our most under-resourced communities. So this is a huge issue, and it's one that's affecting communities and our economy across the board.
Thank you so much. And Nicole, over to you. New York City has in many ways led in terms of research that has highlighted the unique impact of student debt, especially on communities of color within the city. How have you seen this debt spill over to affect the entire community, and in particular, small business?
Great. Hi, Seth. Thanks again for having me on today. Just to highlight, I'm the Deputy Commissioner and Chief of Staff at the New York City Department of Small Business Services. And at SBS, the Department of Small Business Services, our focus is really on unlocking economic potential and creating economic security for all New Yorkers by connecting New Yorkers to good jobs, helping them to create stronger businesses, and to build thriving neighborhoods across the 5 boroughs. But prior to joining SBS, I spent 6 years overseeing the Office of Financial Empowerment at the New York City Department of Consumer and Worker Protection. And during my time at DCWP, one of our primary priorities was to understand and tackle the student loan debt crisis in New York City. And, just to talk a bit about that research that we did and our findings, in order to better understand the student loan debt landscape in New York City, in 2017, DCWP released a report in collaboration with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that was the first of its kind to look at student loan debt on a neighborhood level. And what we learned was that approximately 1 million New York City residents had student loan owing a collective balance of about $35 billion. But it wasn't the aggregate amount of debt that caught our attention as much as the data showing who was most adversely impacted by student loan debt. And we saw that the delinquency and default rate among New York City borrowers was significantly higher in the lowest income neighborhoods. And among those that were delinquent and defaulted in those lower income neighborhoods, 24% owed less than $5,000 on their student loans. We also saw that in New York City, the struggle with student loan debt disproportionately impacts neighborhoods with high rates of Black and Hispanic residents. And in these predominantly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, approximately 16% of student loan debt holders have debt in collections compared to 8% of student loan debt holders in predominantly white and Asian neighborhoods. Now, through that work, we all understand, and I think this has been mentioned, that the opportunity cost of having student loan debt, specifically student loan debt in delinquency or default, the impact could range from an inability to build savings to having to access credit at higher rates because of damaged credit, to an inability to buy a home, or the inability to start a small business. In New York City, there are approximately 240,000 small businesses that employ over 1 million New Yorkers. 62% of these businesses have under 5 employees. So the discussion around student loan debt and equity is one that inevitably impacts small business owners in New York City, and specifically Black business owners. SBS, again, we're focused on equity of access and inclusion. It's at the core of the work that we do. And so when we think about entrepreneurship, we see it as the most viable and sustainable way to close the racial wealth gap. So addressing the issue of student loan debt is very critical. And we'd love to talk more about how we've seen debt be a barrier for small business owners, especially during the pandemic.
So to jump on that, Tanya, so if student debt wasn't an issue, how do you think you'd be able to grow your business? And I think especially with a lens towards the challenges that so many small business owners face in light of the fallout from COVID.
Wow. So if the magic wand just kind of took things away and it allowed Jeans management to grow in the capacity in which our landscape is, I would say that debt would allow me, to grow my business and help individuals to understand what it is to run an efficient business. Right now, just kind of pro bono, my husband and I take on mom and pop shops of 1 to 10 employees, and we don't charge them anything. And it's just a matter of giving back to the community. So in all fairness, I would like to be able to do that for many more people, in being able to, access lines of credit, access funds that may be available to individuals who do things pro bono, not looking at my personal debt, just being able to do that on another platform. So in all honesty, if debt was taken away, the student debt was taken away, or if this were fall of 2021, I would essentially not be able to service the people that I'm servicing right now. So it puts a big onus on, who's going to be my customer, or will I be in business, and how will I continue to be able to support small businesses with a focus on minority businesses. So it plays a great deal.
And Jermaine, I think if you could weigh in here too, and I think as we were prepping, I think it's also just a good reminder, your payments haven't been turned off, right? You still are stuck paying those. So maybe you could also talk about that as well.
Yeah, I wasn't really aware of the difference when I took student loans, what the impact would be I graduated so long ago that I don't even remember if I had anyone who gave me advice. I mean, I hope there's more advisors now, but yes, I do not have the federal student loans and therefore I don't have deferment. But the ability, if I didn't have to either make payments today or long term, if I didn't have my debt increasing month to month, I know that my agency would be more, would have a better competitive advantage with the competitors that I have, which are people can go work for the mental health clinic down in the county, and they can get some of their student loans to be written off if they do some number of years of service, or if they work in rural communities in school districts. There's different pockets that people can work in, and I can't offer those benefits because of the type, for being a for-profit and privately owned and all the, non-government type of industry. And so it's hard to have that competitive advantage when somebody could literally just go a block away from my office and get a job and have up to like $40,000 or $50,000 of their student loans written off. They have to work there for 5 years, but still, it's an interesting concept to think, what if myself or even some of my staff were to be able to have some discount every month, and we would just be so much more free to make decisions instead of feel like we have to work for agencies just so we can barely get by.
An increase in hiring, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So, John, following up on Tanya and Jermaine, you often hear, why should we help student loan borrowers? I don't have student debt or paid back mine. And for me, that's obviously particularly frustrating because I think it underestimates the value that student debt has on all of us. And I think I'm really interested from hearing from you, like across your membership, how you see student debt holding down businesses, holding down rural businesses, and kind of to echo with your view, what we have heard to date about how if we didn't have this weight of student debt, what would it mean, and how you see that from your perch?
Yeah, well, obviously the growth and the vitality of small business is so essential to our economy and to our communities, whether it's creating high quality jobs, economic development, innovation, local communities. And some of what you've heard from Tanya and Jermaine so far is really businesses. A much bigger problem. Tanya talked about credit for loans when you've got the student loans out there. We've heard from a small business owner in Louisiana who said her debt to income ratio is so high she keeps getting turned down for credit. We're hearing from businesses, even the Paycheck Protection Program, which is essentially a forgivable loan. They're being told by lenders that they're not eligible because they're student debt, or they're being or they perceive that. So even getting relief during the pandemic is difficult with this. So in fact, there's a study from the Center for Responsible Lending said that 500,000 self-employed student loan borrowers of color may have missed out on being able to get PPP money. It's also a real hindrance in hiring. First of all, some business owners are just taking on extra time themselves rather than hiring because of the pressure and inability to raise money, but also in looking for and finding employees who can come work for a small business. Small businesses are already at a disadvantage in many ways of big businesses, and now you've got big businesses who can perhaps step in and help small business and help employees with their student debt. And small businesses are not in a position to do that. So it's yet another burden for hiring in the small business community versus the economy as a whole. The list goes on and on. You're just talking about an additional lead weight on the ability of entrepreneurs to move forward and hire people that we really, we didn't need before, and we certainly don't need now.
Thank you so much. I think often people don't realize the interrelationship between how much debt people have and what that means when it turns to their debt to income ratio and their ability to get necessary capital. So Nicole, I think I'd love to turn it over to you to kind of expound on this issue, which is when you talk to small businesses in the city, when you do your work, what challenges do they face? And then I'd love to just start turning it over to solutions. So a two-part question for you, and how have you been trying to think through at a city level that you're able to try to help these folks?
Yeah. I mean, in 2020, New York City was the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis. And, the impact of the pandemic continues to be devastating to our smallest businesses, especially to our immigrant and minority-owned businesses. At SBS, we in the city jumped in to support small businesses from the moment that we had to shut down. And we've tried to focus on what we know are the biggest needs right now, which is primarily financing assistance and complying with new and often changing rules and regulations and so forth. But even before the pandemic, we saw like stark disparities around entrepreneurship in the landscape of entrepreneurship. And, that's only been exacerbated during the pandemic, or really brought to light, some data that has stood out to us, or just some facts. Black-owned businesses, going back to just the disparities around the pandemic and small business ownership and debt. Black-owned businesses in New York City are twice as likely to be closed during the pandemic than their white counterparts. We also found, census survey showed that only 25% of Black businesses receive funding as opposed to 50% of other businesses. And in the federal PPP program, they only received about 12% of what they asked for. When we've spoken to entrepreneurs, and we've also seen that entrepreneurs, especially Black entrepreneurs, have debt, including student loan debt, which has impacted their credit. And that's, we've heard this, and in turn has impeded their ability to not only start a business, but to access this critical financing that will help them keep their businesses afloat during this time. And so I think, we've tried to looking at what are some of those barriers around having these small businesses able specifically to access financing and to continue to grow their businesses. We've taken steps to launch programs that directly address these issues. And our aim to offer these resources have really been about providing equitable access to financing. So, one of the things is looking at, as we kind of address those systemic issues around student loan debt and credit, where are there opportunities for us to kind of change some of the criteria and requirements to access loans, but also how do we help strengthen connections with the small business community and get them the mentorship, the resources and access that they need. And then also, I think just in general, a key to our work is collaboration. I mentioned the work that the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection has done around student loan debt and identifying those that are most adversely impacted. And I think for the city in general, it's been a very multi-pronged approach in terms of focusing on student loan debt. That's one around education, but also around advocacy and policy work that is really important.
And we're going to get back to the advocacy piece that you mentioned, but I also just wanted to tie together something Nicole and John said, which I think is often overlooked, is the way that the punitive nature of the student loan system often goes out of reach. John, I saw that awesome CRL brief too. I don't think most people realize the ramifications of falling behind or struggling or getting in default on your student loans. And I think, we see in like so many contexts where if you default on your loan, this can mean your Social Security gets seized. We've seen this impact people's ability to get jobs. And I think that was, a real eye-opening, hopefully for a lot of people, about how, taking on a student loan to try to get a better life where, you just struggle, life happens, or you go to a predatory institution, end up in default. And the next thing you know, you can't get access to basic lifelines to keep your small business afloat. And I think, we have to be really vigilant about all of these ways in which we really harm people who struggle with student loan debt, and now adding relief during the middle of a pandemic to keep their small business afloat and their employees to have jobs is now one of them. And something I wanted to touch on too, I think to Jermaine and Tanya, is sometimes student debt, no offense, Nicole, is often thought of as this big city or suburban issue. But what I've seen in the course of my travels is just the impact that student debt is having on rural areas. And I think this is especially where all of the partisanship is taken out of the student loan issue. And I'd love for you guys just to talk about how, there's so many challenges already in terms of rural economies and labor markets, but how student debt you see is impacting the economies there as well.
Yeah, I'll share that we have about half of our workforce lives in rural Colorado, and those individuals, generally their pay rates in their communities start significantly lower, but their debt is just as high as somebody else in a bigger city. There's also a lot of times there's less opportunity to have a second job than there might be in the big city, where somebody might have a restaurant job or, do Uber on the weekends. But in a lot of our rural communities, they don't have those types of needs. And so if somebody does go to school and get a big student loan, and then they're probably not going to go back to their rural community because they can't afford to. I mean, maybe the cost of living is lower, but their ability to make revenue with a second job or with just trying to be able to make ends meet, it's harder to do in a rural area. And I absolutely appreciate the staff that we have that do move to rural towns, because they're giving up a lot of opportunity to get out of debt sooner.
Tanya, did you want to add anything on that?
I don't know if I can speak to rural, but I can impoverished areas, so to speak, or lower income family dynamics. And just like Jermaine, I mean, I think what I'm finding is that a lot of it matches up, but in some cases where you are not educated and you don't know what you don't know, and you kind of look at and I'm sorry, student loan is a business. And for those individuals who, want better for themselves, and they are first generationals, and, sometimes those students don't walk away with student loans, but then there are other places that people fall in the holes, and they are being sold on the idea of take this money. And sometimes it's not even about the education. It's about there's money sitting there, and then the registrar's office, or when you're going into financial aid, they're like, sign this piece of paper, get $20,000, and you don't have to pay it. And it reminds me a lot of the push on the credit cards on the campuses. It's not necessary for, if someone is approved for $25,000, for them to take it. So I think the inability to understand the repercussions, not having the feeling that you have to take the money, versus being educated and someone saying to you that's in your circle, or you being able to talk to your parents. Some of our children's parents did not experience student loan debt. So it puts them in a disadvantage. And unfortunately, that debt becomes, the monster of them in the near future.
Yeah, it's such a great point. I think, all of the data we have shows how, the racial wealth gap is, not only a consequence of the student debt crisis, but also one of the causes for it. And I think you articulate so well that we see all of the problems that result in accessing capital and all of these other things. And a lot of that is particularly borne by communities of color who are just forced to take on more debt because they're, the numbers show there's less money in parental contributions, there's less assistance, and you see across all sectors, borrowers of color just forced to take on more debt. And we often don't quantify or think about what the ramifications are that besides their little student, their student loan. But I think you guys make the compelling case, we need to be thinking about what that means in terms of just accessing capital or starting a small business. So, and I think, John, one of the things that I'd love for you to speak about is, we often hear about student loan debt being, a bunch of millennials eating too much avocado toast or, whatever the meme is. And, this really sticks in my craw, right? Because it's, one, it's just not true. But it also kind of pits groups of people against each other. Small business owner, student loan borrowers are small business owners, and they're also the people who shop at small businesses. So I would just love for you to talk about your experience talking to your members and how you see it, about how we just need to think about student loan borrowers are different. Are not different than us. They're not just this group of overprivileged who took on too much debt.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, first of all, student debt is something that cuts across the entire economy and really demographic groups, even people well into their 40s or even 50s are still dealing with it. And they're having to hire people who are younger who are definitely dealing with it, and it's not isolated. And in fact, the problem is even greater in underrepresented communities, whether they be communities of color or, I want to underscore what Jermaine was saying about rural areas. We did a huge study on rural entrepreneurship, and already you're talking about communities that are so under-resourced, they don't have access to the kind of support. They have a employee base that's shrinking because employees are moving to the city. Jermaine's point about how the debt is the same. The ability to pay salaries is lower in rural areas, but the amount of debt is the same. So you're really talking about a problem that's compounded in rural areas and in all underserved areas. The other thing I want to mention, Tony was talking about people taking loans maybe they don't need to take. I mean, another problem is you have these stringent licensing requirements across a lot of industries, and it forces people who aren't as well resourced to pay large sums of money and take loans in order to get credentials. Now, obviously, certain industries need to have certain credentials, but it's a problem. There's too many licensing requirements that are already holding back businesses in maybe less traditional industries. Many of those are in immigrant communities and communities of color and in rural areas, and we have to remove or lessen the pressure on people who can't afford it to have to take out loans in order to get these licenses or certifications when perhaps that much education isn't needed.
It's such a good point. I think people appreciate the intersection between labor markets and student debt and rural communities. I think really to the peril of like a strong, vibrant, diverse American economy. So now at the time left, I really want to start talking about solutions, and I think what policymakers need to hear. So I think we're going to start with Nicole. I'm totally biased because I am such a huge fan of you and the city's work around student loan debt. And a lot of this has really really highlighted how student debt is impacting different communities differently, and some particularly harsh. But I think it also has turned the city into this great advocate, which documents the effect that student debt is having in major metropolitan cities. So, I think it's hard not to take notice when the entirety of New York City is talking about how we need to end the student debt crisis. So I think we'd just love to hear from you. I know you talked a little bit about what you're trying to do at the city level, but what do you think would be helpful to your small businesses, whether that's in Albany or in Congress?
I think just, in general, again, this is a very, I'm going to say complicated and intertwined issue. We talked about the impact that student loan debt can have in the various areas of someone's life, and including what are some of the triggers of that, the need for someone to take on that student loan debt, and then the interconnectedness to the racial wealth gap. I think just given the critical role that small businesses play in our economy and in our communities, it's really important that we're helping to address these barriers that's preventing them from growing and to continue to survive. And again, this pandemic has just shined a really bright light on that. Just from a start, starting with Seth, something you mentioned, of course, more affordable higher education. Going to school has gotten more and more expensive over the years. And, how can we make getting an education and getting like the skills that a small business owner will need to run and operate and grow their business? How do we make that more affordable for those businesses? And then for those small businesses that already have that debt, again, just looking at seeing the impact that student loan debt or other debt can have on their credit, which in turn will prevent them from getting access to critical financing and other supports. One, looking at the credit system too is another system that needs to be addressed. And how do we make sure that student loan debt isn't penalized? Small business owners aren't being penalized for having student loan debt, but can still access critical financing. So I think there is support and necessary support in making higher education more affordable to individuals and small business owners, but also helping those who do have student loan debt access opportunities to either pay down that debt or, there's talk around debt cancellation and things like that, that I think, should be considered. But, knowing the impact that student loan debt has on various aspects of someone's life, including and there's being able to grow and operate a small business, it's just really important that we tackle it from the different angles.
Thank you so much. So I think, Tanya, to kind of put the same question to you with a little different spin, if you could tell policymakers who had the ability to alleviate the burden of student debt one thing, what would it be, and what would you like for them to know?
I think for me, the one thing would be policy around how lenders look at credit when it comes to student debt. I don't think that it should be a culmination of the full picture. You have student debt that is owed to government. So that has to be separated so that it doesn't become a hurdle. So my, again, magic wand would say, my student debt has nothing to do with the ability for me to become a successful small business owner. Don't look at my student debt and allow me the opportunity to grow my business one person at a time and in a community that I wish it to grow.
You get an unfair advantage, Jermaine. You get the same question to you. If you could address the policymakers who had the ability to make a difference here, what would you tell them and what would you want them to know?
My own experience has been that if I would have had 100% of my payments go to the principal, I would have had my student loans written off. And now they're double what they were when I got them. And I would like that to be considered because I maybe wasn't advised very well in college, and I maybe probably stayed longer so that I could have more delay in the starting of my payments. And I probably, made some decisions that I I made those decisions, but now I have paid so much, and now it's double what it was. And I'm not sure that people are aware how it might seem like such a little teeny tiny percentage, but what 7% over 20 years, over 30 years adds up, and it's just going to get bigger.
So it's such a good point. So I think that my organization started scratching the surface on this on the consumer, not the business lending side. And I think what we found really shocked us, which was that the borrowers with the highest debt to earnings, mostly driven because of negative amortization of loans, will pay tens of thousands of dollars more for their normal consumer transactions. So more for a mortgage, more for a car loan, more for their credit card debt, to the tune of $30,000 plus. And I would be really fascinated to know if there's comparable data about the on small business lending, which shows that just how much student debt is driving up either the cost of capital or even just denial of capital. And I think just the other thing is that I would like to tell you both of your guys' story to policymakers, in that people have no idea when they're setting the interest rates or thinking about driving borrowers into negative amortizing loans to such an extent about what the downstream ramifications are on the consumer side or on the small business lending side. And you are definitely not alone in terms of people who, it's not always the principal that gets them. It's the years and years of punishing interest that is really the thing that is like hard to escape. So I'm going to give here the last word to John to round us up, as someone who probably knows what's happening in Washington and state capitals better than all of us. So what are you hearing, and more importantly, what do you think and hope can be done at a policy level that people should be aware of, that people should be thinking about, that people should be fighting for, to help alleviate this struggle that small business owners currently and future are facing with student loans?
Well, first of all, let me just second what Nicole and Tanya and Jermaine have said. Everything they've suggested about this being a complex problem, the difficulty of getting credit. I love Tanya's idea of just getting the student debt removed from that equation. And to Jermaine's point, there needs to be much better education for emerging business owners to help them understand the interplay of all of this. Taking like a 60,000-foot view, the one silver lining that we've seen in all of during the pandemic, and there are plenty of non-silver linings, is that small business is somehow, we've been fighting to get small business in the front of policymakers' consciousness for years. And it's finally happening a little bit more. Policymakers are seeing, wow, this is really a critical part of our economy, of our communities, and maybe we better do something about it. And I think we're seeing small business issues on the front page, so to speak, for the first time. So we need to use this opportunity to take that and to better educate policymakers about what really is behind all of that, all the difficulties of getting credit, issues in communities of color, issues in rural areas. All of that, we have an opportunity now that maybe we didn't have before, kind of bring that together. And I want to thank you, Seth, and your team for really highlighting the student loan issue and how that connects to small business, because that is going to be critical in doing this. Look, we've seen now that the government can be very bold in stepping in to solve a crisis. Hopefully we're not going to have the pandemic forever, but we're still going to have a major crisis in the small business community, particularly in more underserved communities. And the government, we now see the government can take steps to deal with that. Whether it's forgiveness of student loans. I mean, look at the kind of money that's been spent in the last 12 months. It's not unreasonable to say the government needs to step in and just clearly the government has a role to play in helping to fund technical assistance and other education programs. This is something we do. It's a huge part of what we do. But the government has a role it can play. They can expand their work in educating small businesses across the country. So we've seen the government can step up. We need to help them figure out how they can do this on an ongoing basis, and how we can make sure people really understand the role of student debt in our economic crisis, and really as a hindrance to our moving forward and rebuilding better. And I'm optimistic that we have a platform and a forum to do that in a way that maybe we didn't do before. And so all of your voices, the work you're doing, Nicole, and Seth, the work you and your team are doing really is going to be critical. And we look forward to working with all of you to kind of keep this issue alive and look toward long-term solutions that connect the dots here.
Well, I think it's good to end on John's optimism, and I think we're butting up against time. So I just wanted to take a second to thank all of you guys, thank Representative Kim for joining us today. I think one of the things that my organization is committed to is trying to help give a voice to all of those people who are impacted by the student debt crisis, but are often overlooked. And we're just really appreciative for you guys to spend some time on a Zoom when everyone has so much stuff going on. And just for people watching, we're committed to doing this. I think, we've started to do work more around rural and the farming community, around public health issues. So, people should reach out to us if there's other interesting and really impactful ways that student debt is impacting you or your community, because we would love to try to continue on this dialogue. And hopefully we are all reconvening in the not too distant future, where we are talking about how the solutions that Washington and state houses have implemented have really helped all of you. And it could be more of a celebration than a discussion, but that's we're gonna end on John's optimism on that regard. So thank you guys all very much, and thank you guys for tuning in.
Thank you.